Hi, I'm Emily, and with me is Pastor Zach. This week, your sermon covered Genesis 45. How much time passed between the brothers' first and second trips to Egypt?
You're not given an exact timetable. We can put together some pieces of evidence to come up with some rough estimates, perhaps. And really, a big part of this question is how long is Simeon sitting there in prison in Egypt while the brothers are back home? Here's what we do know. We know that the famine is going to last for a total duration of 7 years. By the time that Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, we're now 2 years into the famine because Joseph says there's yet another 5 years to go. The question really then is, how early into the famine did Joseph's brothers originally come seeking help from Egypt and to receive grain? So assuming that was in the first 6 months or so of the famine, then it's very conceivable that Simeon has been left to languish by himself in prison for a year and a half, something of that duration. It's also possible that they came later into the famine. So somewhere within a 2-year period is what we're talking about at the most, probably somewhat inside of that, maybe a year or a year and a half between the brothers' visits. Really, the limiting factor is how long did the food last that they brought home from Egypt. So how early into the famine did they come to Egypt? How long did the food last? And all of that being inside of a 2-year window.
In verse 1, why did Joseph send everyone out of the room before revealing himself to his brothers?
It's one of those things where when you are so overcome with emotion there's no way that you are going to be able to hold back what you know is coming. And in Joseph's particular case, he doesn't merely get to have this personal moment. He's also the leading figure in Egypt. Outside of Pharaoh, there's no one more powerful in the world than he is, or at least in Egypt than he is. It reminds me of a story that I read recently in a biography of the first time that President Reagan interacted with President Gorbachev of Russia. And Reagan's aides had convinced President Reagan to not wear an overcoat that day, even though it was going to be chilly at the place of their meeting, because they thought that Reagan looked better in just his suit. And Gorbachev steps out of his limousine, and he's all dressed up in an overcoat and a top hat. He looks a little bit frumpy. So the next time that they met, Gorbachev sent a note ahead of time asking Reagan if they would be able to wear coats for this particular meeting, because he felt bad that he looked like somebody who needed to be protected from the cold, while the American leader looked strong and as though the weather was not a factor for him. There's a certain projection of power that a leader needs to emanate at all times in order to preserve the credibility of their leadership. So for Joseph to have this excessive emotional display over the very Egyptian people that he's supposed to be ruling over potentially threatens his leadership. Additionally, this is going to be a remarkably intimate personal scene. And so Joseph asks all of those who are not his brothers to leave the room, so that what can occur next is a scene that occurs simply brother on brother.
Joseph almost seems to gloss over his brother's guilt and attributes his being in Egypt to God's plan. Doesn't that diminish the responsibility the brothers have for their sins?
I think we need to hold what's happened in the previous chapters in our minds as we evaluate Joseph's response to his brothers when he finally reveals himself. He clearly informs the brothers that while they had evil intentions, that they sold him into Egypt, that God had a greater purpose to preserve life. And so he's trying to tell the brothers, don't be dismayed about the outcome of you selling me into slavery, because God intended me to be here in order that I could provide great deliverance. And by the way, that great deliverance includes saving your lives, saving our whole family, so that there's a remnant that remains. And yet Joseph has been observing these brothers for a period of time now, probably, as we just were speaking of a minute ago, probably for almost 2 years. And he's put them through the ringer of multiple different tests. And he's heard them now multiple times confess the guilt of their sin. He knows that it's been weighing on their conscience. He knows that they are aware that God has found them out in their sin. He's aware even that they believe that God is punishing them for the evil that they've done. On top of that, he's seen that Judah is willing to put himself in the place of Benjamin for a crime that Judah did not commit in order to save Benjamin's life. He also knows that none of the brothers betrayed Benjamin and left him to rot in Egypt, they all came back to Egypt with him. So he's seen that these are men who are repentant, men who are broken by their sin, men whose consciences have already been convicted by God. And so Joseph doesn't belabor what he already knows. He doesn't beat them down further by saying, don't you know what dirty, rotten scoundrels you are? He knows from observing them already and from what's already come out of their mouths and their actions that they both acknowledge that and that they are changed men. And so now Joseph's goal in forgiving them is to raise up their countenances, that they would experience the true joy and restoration of forgiveness, of what it means to be reconciled in their relationship with the brother who they've harmed. And in doing that, Joseph sets their evil in the greater context of the redemptive good that God has worked according to his purpose.
In verse 7, Joseph says that God had used him in order to preserve a remnant. What is the theological significance of a remnant?
Yeah, this idea of remnant becomes really significant throughout the rest of the whole biblical narrative. You'll see this particularly during times of the exile. You also see this in the context not only of a physical group of people, that there's a tangible, a physical line that's preserved, but also in a spiritual sense, that even when there's great apostasy, that God preserves a remnant who are faithful to him. And so this thread really kind of begins here, that even among this broad threat of possible destruction that has global implications, this is the whole ancient world in that region is caught up in this famine, so that all the world, as we read, is coming to Egypt. All the ancient world is coming for food that Joseph provides. Of particular significance is preserving this family that as of yet has not grown into the full-fledged nation that God promised to Abraham. This is still a large family by our standards, yes, but a relatively small group of people. And so the relative fragility of this family with this existential threat of the famine threatens to extinguish the line of promise connected back to the divine promise in Genesis 3:15, that from the woman is going to come this seed who is going to crush the head of the serpent. And so really what Joseph is identifying is this promise that is then brought forward to Abraham, that his family will grow into a nation that will bless the other peoples of the world. This remnant of Jacob, this family line, it needed to be preserved. And so Joseph recognizes there's greater promises at stake here. And so he calls that into mind as he is revealing that this salvation isn't merely a personal salvation of congratulations, Dan and Issachar, Naphtali, you guys get to have food tomorrow. It's more than that. It has a greater redemptive purpose than that. This is connected to God's promises, both past and also their future implications. And thus, this little family, fledgling nation needed to be preserved.
What does Joseph mean by saying that God has made him a father to Pharaoh in verse 8?
Really, this is a indication of the level of power and prestige that Joseph is enjoying in Egypt. It's, of course, not literally that he is now considered to be Pharaoh's father, but essentially Pharaoh looks to him for advice and counsel. Pharaoh relies on Joseph's wisdom. So in the same way that we might look to our fathers to provide us with help and wisdom for various situations we might encounter in life, or as a resource to ask how we might handle a particular situation, we rely on their experience and wisdom to help us. That's essentially the position in Egypt that Joseph is occupying, the most trusted counselor to Pharaoh, one who is almost looked on in a fatherly way on Pharaoh's part. What's particularly interesting about that expression, though, is when you consider who the Egyptians considered Pharaoh to be. They considered Pharaoh to be a son of the gods. And so for Joseph to say he's become like a father to Pharaoh, and for Pharaoh to have confessed about Joseph that clearly God is with you, that this is a man in whom the Spirit of God dwells, as Pharaoh says to his counselors. It's as though Pharaoh is looking at Joseph as this mouthpiece or this representative of the wisdom of God. And so rather than Pharaoh being this child of the gods, Joseph himself, who represents the wisdom of the Spirit of God to Pharaoh, has now occupied that place of being the mediator between Pharaoh and the wisdom that's accessible from God, which is exactly the kind of role that we see Joseph occupying in Egypt. So beyond just kind of the paternal overtones, there's this deeper significance when you consider the Egyptian mythology around the origin or paternity of Pharaoh.
You mentioned that it has been 22 years since Joseph was sold into slavery. How did you get to that number?
Yeah, so if we recall that Joseph is sold by his brothers when he is 17 years old, that's really our foundational starting point. And then when Pharaoh has his dreams and Joseph's called into the court of Pharaoh and Joseph recounts to Pharaoh the meaning of his dreams, and then Pharaoh appoints him over all of the affairs of Egypt, we read that when Joseph comes into service for Pharaoh, Joseph is at this time 30 years old, which means that 13 years have elapsed since the time that Joseph left his brothers or was sold into slavery by his brothers to now become ruler of Egypt. There's then the 7 years of plenty. So if we have the 13 years that Joseph spends in Egypt, in Potiphar's house, in prison, and then finally appointed to Pharaoh, when he begins his appointment, 13 years, and then the first 7 years of the fullness of the harvest, of the time of plenty, that then gets us to the beginning of the famine. Joseph, when he reveals himself to his brothers, says that the famine's now been in the land for 2 years, 5 remain. So we have 13 years that Joseph spends in Egypt. Then he's appointed to Pharaoh, 7 years of plenty, and then 2 years of famine. So we put those numbers together, and we have Joseph being removed from the land of his father for 22 years at the time that he reveals his identity to his brothers.
If you have any questions from the sermon or the sermon passage that you would like to have answered on the podcast, please email them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning to questions@westcannon.org. We'll see you next week.